What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again talking some college football DFS ahead of New Year's Eve, December the 31st. We have the college football playoff. We have another two games making up a four-game slate in total. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. Let's dive right into it. 4 games up, 4 games down. We're going to start with the morning games and then get into the college football playoff as a part of this 4-game slate. First thing we have here is Wake Forest taking on Rutgers. Rutgers is filling in, of course, for Texas A&M. The spread is minus 15 in favor of Wake Forest, 62-point total. This game has the potential to be very fast and very high scoring, some suspect defenses. And Wake Forest plays extremely fast, 81.5 plays per game, balanced in terms of pass rate. Rutgers actually plays above average as well. They just struggle with efficiency in offense. They're more of a running-based team, and that suits them well here against a Wake Forest defense, which is markedly worse against the run. They're allowing over 200 yards per game. On the Wake Forest side, Sam Hartman has been an excellent signal caller this year. He's averaging over 300 yards per game through the air. That's on 36 attempts, and he has 343 yards on the ground. He is one of the better quarterback plays right out of the gate here. 62-point total is very high, and Hartman involved in both phases of the game. Rutgers defense certainly doesn't scare you. So Hartman, I think, is right away a very, very good play here. Stacking him is actually, I think, a little bit easier. And that's because Jocker Roberson opts out of the game. He's going to the NFL. And that might seem a little bit weird, but Roberson and Nate Perry were basically a thorn in the side of DFS players all year because they're both amazing. They're both expensive, and it's really hard to stack them both. But now without Roberson, A.T. Perry is the clear target leader of this team. He averaged 90 yards per game, 8.6 targets, 12 targets per game over the last 4 games. So A.T. Perry is clearly a priority. And then you also have Taylor Morin and Donald Stewart. They should walk into every down roles now. These are guys that already average 6 and 5.3 targets per game over the last 4 games, and they're both extremely cheap. Donald Stewart is 3,500. I mean, he should be extremely popular here. Keyshawn Williams, he should also play a little bit. He's kind of going to be the situational wide receiver 4. And then Blake Whitehart, Brandon Chapman, they basically split the tight end position 50-50, and neither of them are particularly strong targets. I think you're just basically running out A.T. Perry, Taylor Morin, and Donald Stewart's going to be the glue that fits all the studs in your lineups. At running back, it is a 4-way timeshare. Both Justice Allison and Christian Beal-Smith returned from their late season injuries. Beal-Smith has a slight lead on this job, but I mean, we're talking like 10 carries. And then you have Christian Turner, 6 carries, Justice Ellison and Cooley, both 4. It's a little bit skewed because they lost to Pitt in the championship game here, but it's a timeshare. Even Amani Marshall, he's been playing a little bit. He did transfer, and he's going to App State now, but I think overall he's not going to play in this game. At least it's 4 backs instead of 5, but still pretty tough to get to. Rutgers taking the call up on short notice. Noah Vidral is going to start the game. Not too much job security here. He's mainly because of injury, but I would expect Vidral to play most of the game here, if not all. Good as a rusher, 267 yards on the ground. It would have been more had he not gotten hurt multiple times this year. As a passer, leaves a lot to be desired. 144 yards per game. Again, somewhat depressed because of injuries, but he's just not dynamic. He's cheap enough to maybe take a look at here because Wake Forest defense is so bad and he's involved on the ground. But still, he's tough to get to. In the run game, Isaiah Pacheco already declared for the NFL draft. He has not said one way or another whether he'll play in this game. His draft declaration came before Rutgers was bowl eligible, so just don't know with Pacheco. Their coach wouldn't comment either. Tentatively, I would say he doesn't play, but honestly, just keep your eyes out. He would be a great play if he is active. He's only 4,200. Nobody seems to be expecting it. That means Aaron Young should be the lead back here. Kyle Monangai has been hurt, and his status hasn't been updated either. So there's a chance for a lot of value in this Rutgers backfield, depending on who's available. It might just be Aaron Young. And I mean, Johnny Langen's been carrying the ball a lot. He's labeled as a quarterback on DraftKings, but he's like a hybrid player. He will split the work, but Young could be in a really good spot here. Monangai, he would split the work 50-50 with Young and Langen if he's healthy. We just don't know. In the receiving game, no Aaron Cruikshank. He's been out for multiple weeks now. So you have Bo Melton as the target leader. He's averaging 8.5 targets per game. And Vidral's only had eyes for him, so I think he's a solid play. But if you need a punt, Shameen Jones at 3,500. He's definitely not the same punt as Stewart on the other side. But if you're looking for a secondary play for Rutgers, it would be him. Isaiah Washington's just been in a change of pace role. He's kind of splitting the work with Brandon Sanders. I mean, the rest of the group, Joshua Youngblood, Christian Dremel's even played 40% of the snaps. Outside of Shamin and Bo, it's a pretty big mess. Tight end is a split as well between Giovanni Haskins, Matt Alamo. Just not a spot you really want to get to or need to get to. Game 2, Central Michigan taking on Washington State. Both of these teams had their opponents bow out of their bowl games, but fortunately enough, they were able to work this out where they can play each other. 58-point total is pretty good, 7.5-point spread in favor of Washington State, giving them a very nice implied team total. Central Michigan's fast, 76 plays per game. They're balanced in terms of pass rate, 49%, and they're not good on defense. So that's a spot that we could potentially look at for Washington State. On the other side, Washington State plays a little bit slower, but they're very pass heavy. 54% pass rate for them. So this game has some sneaky appeal. First things first with Central Michigan, Daniel Richardson's their signal caller. He's not mobile, and he's only averaging about 200 passing yards per game. Some of that's depressed because Jacob Sermon got a look earlier in the season. You're going to get more work from that out of Richardson. It's just, can he overcome a pretty good Washington State defense? That's the question. He does have the receiving options to do it. Wide receiver 1, Khalil Pimpleton's there, averaging 8.3 targets per game. Wide receiver 2, Ja'Cory Sullivan, banged up throughout the year, so he doesn't have as many targets as Dallas Dixon on the year, but he does average more per game. He averages more receiving yards per game, so don't be fooled by that. Ja'Cory Sullivan's the wide receiver 2. Dixon's the 3, and then Joel Wilson is the tight end at a very cheap price if you're just looking for a punt to stack. But the real guy we need to talk about is Lew Nichols, and Lew Nichols is 9,500. The guy has, listened to these carry counts, 26, 43, 32, and 44 in their last 4 games. He's also active as a receiver. He's 44 targets on the year. This is the best workload in college football. Not on the slate, not in the MAC, not in the G5, in college football. So Lew Nichols is an underdog here. That matters, but not a ton. The difference is I think you don't see 40 carries and instead maybe you see 25, 30 for Lew, but he's going to backdoor his way into 100 yards more likely than not. 142 yards on the ground per game, another 24 through the air. On the Washington State side, Jaden Delores, the signal caller, somewhat mobile with 100 yards on the ground this year, cumulatively averages about 250 per game on 32 attempts. He also split time with Jarrett Garantano a little bit to start the year, so these are a little bit depressed. But Central Michigan's defense definitely doesn't scare you through the air. They're vulnerable, and you have 3 pretty clear options in the pass game. They basically only use 4 receivers, but Travell Harris, Calvin Jackson, they have essentially the same target volume at the top. Jackson's a little bit more dynamic downfield, and he's cheaper, so he's my preference, but it's very slight. I'll be playing both of these guys for sure, with just a slight preference to Jackson. Dazon Stribling is the wide receiver 3. He's priced way below these guys at 4,100, and he honestly shouldn't be. He's averaging 6 targets per game in the last 4. That's only a target and a half behind Jackson. So saving $2K with him, that makes a lot of sense. And then Donovan Ollie's on the field every single play. He's just not targeted as much as the 3 receivers above him. 3,700, that's a good price, but with Stribling right there, I'm just not sure you need to play Ollie. In the run game, this is where we might have a ton of value. So Max Borghi opted out. He's not going to play. Deion McIntosh didn't make the trip because of injury. We are left with Nikhil Watson as the only other running back that's handled a carry this year, the Wisconsin transfer, at 3,500 as a 7.5-point favorite for a team with a 33-point implied team total against a bad defense. Nikhil Watson is a fantastic play on this slate. He hasn't caught a target yet this year, but I'm not sure it matters. He should see a ton of opportunity here in this pass game. And if you're looking for the backup, according to all reports, it's Juvensly Bazil. He has not carried the ball yet this year, but again, that's Juvensly Bazil. I don't know what the split's going to look like, but the coaching staff has pointed a lot to Nikhil Watson. Going to the college football playoff, we're going to kick things off with Alabama taking on Cincinnati, 57.5-point total. Alabama's team total is 35 points. This is a 13-point spread in favor of the Crimson Tide. 2 very different teams. Alabama's very fast, very pass-heavy. Cincinnati's very slow, very run-heavy. Part of that because they've taken their foot off the gas multiple times this year. So for Alabama, they're clearly a cut above in terms of level of competition. From a DFS perspective, Bryce Young is going to be facing a tough defense on paper. So Cincinnati has a fantastic secondary. Everybody talks about Sauce Gardner, their pass rushers, Bryant, very good unit, but they play in the AAC. The best competition they faced this year is Notre Dame, and they haven't been tested like Alabama is going to test them. So Bryce Young still projects very well. He averages 330 yards per game in the SEC. He is mobile, 31 yards on the ground. He just doesn't take off much, but he does have that scrambling ability. So Bryce Young, he's still a good play in a tough matchup, and he's easy to stack. You have John Mechie out for the year. He tore his ACL. So Jamison Williams is the clear alpha in this spot. 8,800 is a ton to pay for him, but this guy should see double-digit targets nearly without a doubt. He already averages 100 yards per game, over 100 yards per game. Slade Bolden should be the wide receiver too. When Mechie went down in the SEC championship, Slade Bolden immediately saw 8 targets. So he stands out here. Alabama uses a lot of 12 personnel, which is something they could do. So you'll probably see Jaleel Billingsley and Cameron Latou on the field a decent amount at the same time. Billingsley's more of the receiving threat, and he also saw five targets when Mechie went down, which is something to note. And from there, the wide receiver 3 is a little bit hard to target right now. So Ja'Cory Brooks played on about 40% of the snaps in back-to-back weeks, but JoJo Early's been hurt, and allegedly he'll be a game-time decision here. Early was ahead of Brooks to start the year, but I think Brooks is probably the safer play right now. Trayshawn Holden's just a rotational guy, and I see him as a distant third in this pecking order behind Early if he plays and Brooks. So if I'm punting the Alabama third receiver, I'm going to take a shot on Ja'Cory Brooks based on his presence on the field lately. In the run game, they've had so many injuries that Brian Robinson just by default is going to handle a heavy workload. And then if this game is competitive, you might see him upwards of the 27 carries we saw in their third most recent game. Right now, I mean, they've lost so many guys in the backfield as well. Jace McClellan, he went down. Roydell Williams had surgery at the end of the year on his knee. We don't know the extent of that surgery, so there's a chance he'll be back, but I would see that as being very slim. Trey Sanders is just going to be your change of pace. So Brian Robinson should have a massive workload. And this is where you want to attack Cincinnati. They're strong against the pass, weaker against the run. They allow 141 yards per game, which might not seem like a lot. It's not. It's still pretty good, but it's weaker than their pass defense. On the Cincinnati side, this might be the game script where we finally see Ritter pushed a little bit. He's averaging career lows in rushing, which is not good for DFS. But again, playing Navy and Tulsa and Tulane, it's not really going to test you like in Alabama is. So Ritter, maybe there's a little bit of a chance that he sees elevated work. 361 yards on the ground this year. Again, it's career low. As a passer, 245.5 yards per game is pretty good. This is the toughest matchup for Ritter. He's expensive for what you're paying for him. I would honestly rather play one of the quarterbacks in the 2 previous games rather than try to roll the dice on Ritter in the toughest game of his career. In the backfield, Jerome Ford, former Alabama player, is the feature back, and we should see nothing less here. 7,200 is a lot to pay for him in the toughest game of his career. He averages 18 touches per game, which should be elevated now that he's back from injury, and this is a tough spot. He's at severe risk of being phased out because they're 13-point underdogs, but he's still live in tournaments. In the receiving game, you might be able to target some of these guys. Unfortunately, Cincinnati uses a pretty nasty rotation. Alec Pierce is really the only consistent option, and he's 6K. So you're paying a lot for a guy that averages just 6 targets per game. Still, this should be the spot where and when they're not, they'll split time 50-50 between Leonard Taylor, Josh Wiley. Taylor's 100 cheaper, and he has more targets on the year. I would prefer Taylor, but Wiley certainly in play. He's been a red zone weapon, and Wiley actually has more receiving yards. From there, Michael Young's expected back. He's missed the last 3 games. He was the wide receiver 2 before he went down with injury. He should play a pretty good role here. 3,700 is a nice dart throw if you're looking for a run back on Alabama stacks. And then you'll have Tyler Scott as the wide receiver 3 most of the time. Trey Tucker mixing in as a change of pace. Their snaps were about 60% in the AAC championship for Scott, about 30% for Tucker. So I would rather find the 500, play Scott, or just pay down for Young. In our final game, we have Michigan taking on Georgia. This is the worst game on the slate from a DFS perspective because it's a 44.5-point total. Georgia is a 7.5-point favorite. This line has cratered once we got news that Georgia is dealing with a little bit of a COVID outbreak on their team. Was 9.5 before that news came out. So not sure if the line will move or not. But these teams have very low totals. Michigan's below 20 points. As far as implied team total, they both play slow. They both play run heavy. But one of these teams is going to win out, and the other one likely will be forced into passing scripts. Cade McNamara, he's been the victim of run-heavy game scripts all year. We've really only seen him play from behind once against Michigan State, and he played very well in that contest. He's not the most mobile. He only has 27 yards on the ground. And if you play McNamara, it's probably on the basis that Georgia gets up in the game early and he has to get them back in the game coming from behind. McNamara is a GPP play at best. We have seen targets spike for the receivers in those game scripts. Cornelius Johnson's the 1, Roman Wilson's the 2, Mike St. Ristill's the 3, but they do rotate some other receivers on the field. Dalen Baldwin, Angel Anthony, these guys will mix onto the field. But if I'm playing one of them, Cornelius is at a cheap enough price where he's my priority, followed by Roman Wilson at 4,200. St. Ristill's a distant third. Eric All is kind of a volatile dart throw. His snaps, they kind of fluctuate a little bit because he plays the tight end position. Sometimes he functions as an H-back. He still is the third leading receiver on the team, so I think you can throw darts with Eric All. The backfield will be a big talking point here. If Michigan can play to their preferred game script and maybe score initially, you'll see a lot of volume for Hassan Haskins and Blake Corum. These guys were in a 50-50 timeshare before Corum went down with an injury pretty late in the year. He has since returned, but they eased him back into action, and that was fine. They, even against Ohio State, they just blew him out so badly that Corum only carried the ball 5 times. Before the injury, Corum was the preferred pass catcher. Haskins was more of like the grinder back, lightning to thunder in the offense, if you want to put it in those terms. But without Corum, Haskins played really well, and he played really well in the pass game. So I think this is going to be like a 70-30 split in Haskins' favor. But Corum, he will still have a role, and he's 4,400. So you could definitely play him as a salary saver. On the Georgia side, Stetson Bennett was named the starter for this game. I'm not sure the leash is very long with him because they have JT Daniels, the starter at the beginning of the year, waiting in the wings. Daniels just got hurt, ceded the work to Stetson, and Stetson never gave it back. But Bennett did play very bad in the SEC championship, so there is risk that Daniels comes in if this game gets out of hand. Stetson's mobile, Daniels is not. Stetson has 251 yards on the ground this year. Both have been very efficient as a passer on low volume because Georgia's killed all their opponents outside of Bama in that championship game. But similar to McNamara on the other side, you really need negative game script to coax these players into their ceiling environments. Otherwise, if Georgia's ahead, they're just going to lean on the run. In the run game, they use 4 backs. Zamir White is the running back 1 in terms of carries. James Cook is the preferred pass catching back. But recently in that SEC championship game and the last 2 games, James Cook's out carried Zamir White too. So there appears to be a little bit of a changing of the guard. James Cook working ahead of Zamir White. It's still going to be a split regardless. Kendall Milton might be able to get back. He had a knee sprain and he was not able to work his way back for the SEC championship, and now he's had extra time to rest. You should see him. Kenny McIntosh, those guys will be change of pace backs, not worth targeting for DFS. In the receiving game, complete mess. The only player we know for sure is going to be on the field nearly every play and have a consistent target share is Brock Bowers. 15 targets against Alabama in the SEC championship, gets carries out of the backfield. Like, this guy is so dynamic for a freshman tight end. He's just $7K, which is a lot to pay for him when you have guys like Taylor Morin at a cheaper price. And I mean, like A.T. Perry, that's what I meant. Taylor Morin, I guess, as well. In the receiving game, you have Adonai Mitchell, you have Jermaine Burton. Those guys played about 50% of the snaps. Ladd McConkey was down at 30%. Kearis Jackson down around 30%. Jack Saint didn't really even play. And then you have players like George Pickens at 30%. He saw 5 targets. And my question with the Georgia rotation at receiver is, if that game had been more competitive against Alabama, would Pickens have played more snaps? Because when he was out there, 30% of snaps, he was targeted a ton. 5 targets on that volume. Of course, Pickens is coming off an ACL tear from the spring game, so this guy hasn't had a full year's recovery yet. He's now had a couple extra weeks, and I think Pickens probably works his way into a larger share of the snaps here. That probably comes at the expense of guys like Adonai Mitchell and Ladd McConkey. I think you have a player in, Jermaine Burton, who seems pretty locked into his role. But this is a volatile situation. At tight end, they do use a lot of 12. That means Darnell Washington will be on the field too. He's more of a blocker at this point, only 1 target in each of the last 4 games. But if I'm ranking these receivers for Georgia, Brock Bowers is 1 in a vacuum. Number 2 is probably Pickens at 3,900 with his 5 targets. 3 is going to be Jermaine Burton. And then after that, you're just throwing darts with the Adonai Mitchells, the Ladd McConkeys. But that will do it for the New Year's Eve main slate, the college football playoff main slate. Let me know who your favorite play is in the comments section. I'm Matt Gajewski on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Thank you guys for sticking with us. couple more slates left to cover, and the national championship. We will have it all for you. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time.